listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon. NATO is looking for trouble in the Pacific as U.S. war games reveal a devilish plot to build a military coalition against China. Joining us to discuss this, we've got Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and a researcher. Dr. Gerald Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I understand you have a recent book that's come out. What's your latest of the dozens of books that you've written? What's your latest, Dr. Horne?
Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
Sounds like my kind of book. Let's start here. NATO charts a new course. This is at Continent USA. The July 2024 summit in Washington threatens to set in train a Cuban Missile Crisis of truly global magnitude. And one of the things this article discusses is what is often referred to as great power competition, wherein on the borders, there's kind of unwritten rules that if one great power comes to the border of another great power, is going to be trouble. And right now, the U.S. is in Ukraine. The U.S. is in Taiwan. One of the three great powers is coming to the borders of the other two, stirring up all kinds of trouble. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, it's clear that U.S. imperialism and its accomplices in NATO are threatening World War III. And it's important to add that China is in the bullseye. That is to say, what was remarkable about this NATO summit, the 75th anniversary, noted and marked in Washington, D.C., was this inattention to geography. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization mentioned China repeatedly in its various communiques. Now, we had thought that when NATO came into being 75 odd years ago, that Moscow was the major target. And to be sure, Moscow remains a major target, as evidenced by this escapade in Ukraine. However, what's happening right now as we speak, and it's important for our audience to focus on this, is that 50-odd years ago, U.S. imperialism cut a deal with Maoist China, an anti-Soviet deal, in order that Maoist China would turn against the Soviet Union, which then played a role in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991. The payoff to China was huge. Massive foreign direct investment, creating this juggernaut, and China is now ahead of U.S. imperialism and its imperialist accomplices in green energy, in quantum computing, and of course, it's challenging NVIDIA of Silicon Valley in microchips. And by the way, Financial Times of London had an article just the other day that suggested, hold on to your chair, that NVIDIA could be a, quote, $50 trillion, unquote, corporation within years. And China is exceeding NVIDIA as we speak. Not to mention the fact that the other major manufacturer of microchips, important for everything from laptops to automobiles, is TSMC of Taiwan, which odds are will probably be part of China officially within a decade or so. China is ahead in lunar exploration, as evidenced by its journey to what we call the far side of the moon. And so the only hope for U.S. imperialism right now is somehow to manipulate India against China, but that's more than a notion. Recall that even though these two giants fought a war in 1962, since then, bridging the gap between India and China has been, of course, Moscow. And Prime Minister Modi visiting Moscow just a few days ago suggests that it will be more than a notion, once again, to get India to join this anti-China train, particularly since India is the eye in BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. India is part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which had its summit in Kazakhstan just a few days ago. And so this presents a real dilemma for U.S. imperialism. And what's curious, Garland, is that we've seen this movie before. Recall that it was in 1904, 1905, that the previous Anglo-centric superpower, speaking of London, speaking of Great Britain, it funded the rise of Japan, which then waged war against, you guessed it, Russia. And then, of course, Japan repaid the favor a few decades later by virtually destroying the British Empire single-handedly by seizing Hong Kong in 1941 and Singapore in 1942. And this exemplifies the fact that in some ways his history's tides are moving against these rapacious powers, be they in London or in Washington, D.C. And so I think it's important to note that as we also speak, the U.S.-led coalition is engaged in these war games in the Pacific and Hawaii. And once again, it's important to point out that the U.S. imperialism, when it rose to the heights of being a superpower, did it in no small measure by overthrowing the Hawaii Kingdom in a bloody coup in 1893 and then creating an apartheid state in Hawaii and then incorporating this colony to the 50th and let's hope final state of the United States of America in 1959. But in any case, Hawaii is now the scene for these environmentally challenging war games that have aroused mass protests in the Hawaiian archipelago. And what's curious and remarkable about that is that these war games and the threats that they pose to China, which is the major target, this is simultaneously placing pressure on U.S. allies in South Korea, speaking of President Yoon, and in Tokyo, speaking of Prime Minister Kishida. They might be collateral damage as a result of joining this bellicosity. Recall that during the battle days of the U.S. war in Indochina, there was this rather stunning trope that emerged where the U.S. military said that it had to destroy a village in order to save it. It's that sort of cockamamie, cockeyed logic that we now see unfolding on a broader scale. That is to say, the aforementioned deal with Maoist China against the Soviet Union involved weakening U.S. imperialism, supposedly in order to strengthen U.S. imperialism. And now U.S. imperialism is weakening global imperialism, speaking of erstwhile allies in Seoul and Tokyo and Taiwan, supposedly in order to strengthen world imperialism. This is the sort of bizarro world in which we find ourselves.
You know, and recently, you know, to bring Africa into it, the U.S. and French colonialism are falling apart there. I don't know if you're familiar with the recent speech. Are you familiar with the recent speech of the leader of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré?
Well, of course. Mr. Traoré was in Moscow quite recently, embracing, literally and figuratively, President Putin. He has been the spearhead of the alliance of Sahel states that includes Niger and Burkina Faso. These states represent a frontal rebellion, not only against French neo-colonialism, but U.S. imperialism. Recall that U.S. imperialism was kicked out of Niger unceremoniously. This also presents a challenge to U.S. and French allies in the region. Speaking of the French puppet regime of Ivory Coast, the U.S. ally, that is Nigeria, the erstwhile mainstays of the economic community of West African states, which is now falling apart in the seams because it's being challenged by the alliance of Sahel states. But that's not all. As you survey the African continent, you begin to see that French neo-colonialism is on the back foot, particularly in Algeria, which fought a bloody war against French militarism before emerging independence in 1962. It's a major supplier of natural gas, helping to keep homes in Western Europe warm. But the regime in Algeria is now pressing a hard bargain, which obviously is compromising to the Western European states, who simultaneously, we are told, are seeking to boycott Russian natural gas. Likewise, the new regime in Niger is pressing a hard bargain with regard to sending its uranium to French nuclear plants in order to supply French homes with electricity. It, too, as noted, is driving a hard bargain. And, of course, all of this is weakening President Macron, who just suffered a staggering defeat in the parliamentary election with the new Popular Front led by Communist Socialist Greens and the former Trotskyist Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France unbowed his political formation. They are now dickering with President Macron to make sure that one of their own is emerging as the new prime minister, a significant blow against the pretensions not only of French neocolonialism, but its ally and comrade in U.S. imperialism.
You know, looking also, if we could stay on that subject for a second, when I just look at a map, when I look at the Sahel region, I look at, you know, Mali, the Burkina Faso, Mali, I look at, I understand that Senegal is considering joining that coalition. You've got Chad, who's in question, Sudan. There's a possibility that this, in some time and maybe even the near future, that this coalition could cut right down the middle of a center of Africa, could slice Africa right in half, which would be the death knell, would it not, for AFRICOM?
Indeed. And we should not neglect in this litany of Gabon, oil-rich Gabon, a former French puppet under the Bongo dynasty, which collapsed in August 2023. We should not forget Congo Brazzaville, to be distinguished from the larger Congo, which is a former French colony, but historically has been in the vanguard, particularly ideologically and politically, not only of so-called French West Africa, but of Africa and the Pan-African world as a whole. You mentioned my book on the Panthers just a few moments ago, and Congo Brazzaville played a preeminent role in that book because it allied with the Black Panther Party and other Black leftists back in the day. And once again, just like Mr. Traore, the leader of Congo Brazzaville, paid his respects to President Putin in Moscow within the last few weeks or so. So once again, world imperialism is in crisis, but that does not necessarily mean that it will go down without a fight, because a beast, which is what imperialism is oftentimes most dangerous when it's cornered and feels like it's losing its grip, which is precisely the state of affairs today as we speak.
And I'll say this, to me, and I think imperialism, I think the neoliberal capitalist, et cetera, their biggest fear is internal uprising. I mean, I think that has to be their biggest fear right now. If you look at what's happening with Joe Biden, he's pretty much toast. He's done. I think the Democratic Party is throwing in the towel. But again, I keep bringing this up. Look at Sunak, what happened to him. Starmer's not well liked. Macron's done. Schultz is finished. Kishida, horrible numbers. I could go on and on. Yoon in South Korea. All throughout the empire, the entire empire, Trudeau, the people despise their leaders. We only got about a minute. How can they keep up this clown show when they're going to have to worry about internal uprisings?
Well, you have a solid and valid point. But we should keep in mind, once again, that these rapacious powers are oftentimes most dangerous when it seems like they're on the ropes. So let me point you to Prime Minister Meloni in Rome, in Italy, perhaps the leader of neo-fascist global white supremacy, who is being challenged not only from the immigrant population, which is heavily African coming across the Mediterranean, but also from her left. Recall that it was not so long ago that the most powerful communist party in the capitalist world was precisely in Italy. And so, once again, let me reiterate, let me repeat that this imperialist monster is weakening, but that does not necessarily mean it will go down without a fight. It will go down, I'm afraid to say, as a result of knockout blows that we administer to it unceremoniously.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher.